basically, it's a dungeon crawling game in the mold of, I guess, Descent initially, but that Descent mold from Fantasy Flight Games has spawned numerous similar games: Star Wars Imperial Assault, Mansions of Madness, technically, and obviously Doom. And what Fantasy Flight tend to do is put lots of really good miniatures in the box, use a modular board system, and then they adapt their core rules using cards, tokens, different kinds of dice to create different outcomes. And as you'll see in my written review, I don't want to give it all away, but basically, I think they've done an incredible job in making Doom the board game actually feel like Doom the 2016 computer game, which I think is particularly spectacular because it is a board game, and Doom the video game is so visceral, so brutal, so fast-paced that I just, if I was going to make a board game of it, I probably wouldn't have even tried to emulate it. I would probably have tried to do something completely different. And yet just using cards, dice, and miniatures on a board, they've managed to make a game that really feels authentic.
When you say it feels authentic, and that the game's obviously quite fast paced, like the original was, it's a little bit more vertical. There's all of the kind of the brutal finisher kills. How does that translate over to the board game?
Yeah, I mean that's actually what's great about the board game. So the brutal finishers, the glory kills, they're actually in the game. And they feel very much like they feel in the video game. And this is why I was quite surprised they've managed to achieve that. So, I mean, without getting into all the systems, you've kind of got this situation where you have up to 4 Marines, and you have a player called the Invader. So it's the classic, team of up to 4 good guys versus one person who plays all the baddies. And so the balancing there is that if you've only got one player, the Marine gets certain perks, whereas if you've got 2 to 3 players, they get different perks. And if you've got all 4 Marines, you basically get no perks because you've got a lot more firepower. And the game uses a card-based initiative system to decide the playing order on each turn. So it's completely randomized each turn. And you might have a situation where, one turn ends with the Invader taking a couple of turns, doing a couple of really heavy attacks, and then the next turn is randomized again, and the Invader might attack again immediately. So the kind of push and pull of combat is never absolutely certain. And this leads to a situation where the Marines and the Invader, really, using some of the troops, particularly imps, are forced to kind of jump in and out of combat in a way that I don't think I've ever seen in a board game, really. The only board game I have played that feels anywhere similar to that is Conan, and that's because of the fatigue system there. So, you've got this gameplay really in Doom where you can use a card to generate an amount of movement points. You can charge up to a Baron of Hell. You can blast him with a super shotgun if you've got the cards in hand to do so. And then if you move into the same space as him using your remaining movement points, once he's reached a stagger value, which is a certain amount of damage, you will automatically glory kill him by being on his space. That will allow you to increase your health and draw a glory kill card. And that glory kill card might grant you more health, or it might give you a boost to your attack. And again, if you've got more cards in hand that you can play, which depends on what they say, whether they're primary attacks or secondary, you can just keep chaining these attacks together. So you get these legitimate situations where a Marine that's equipped with a chainsaw, for example, could literally run up to a demon, damage it severely using the buff that the chainsaw gives to reducing the stagger value, instantly glory kill it, redeem your health, jump to the next one, chainsaw that one. And this kind of chained attack stuff kind of works really organically in the game, and it happens every single turn. And in response, the demons have these massive attacks where they're rolling 4 or 5 or 6 dice using a power-up feature called Argent Power. So it's just a really, really visceral, combat-focused experience. And if the Marines die, they just respawn exactly as they do in the video game. And the Overlord player just gets a frag token. And the Overlord's objective is actually just to get frag tokens. So everything about the game is really focused on bringing the two sides together in combat. And when that happens, it's genuinely exciting and very, very interesting.
That sounds absolutely amazing, to be honest. I mean, if you're playing as the invaders, the enemies, is there kind of like do they have an infinite amount of spawns, or is it sort of, as you say, it's a modular board system? Is it each particular board's got a particular setup of enemies on it, or how does that work?
So there's actually two answers to that. So you can actually do. There's two campaigns basically. There's two campaigns of 6 missions, which for the history buffs among us starts off with a campaign or a mission called Knee Deep in the Dead, which I thought was quite good, harking back to the original Doom. And you can play through those 12 scenarios, but if you do, you still don't come up against a completely fixed set of invaders. So take Descent, for example. You know, the enemies in Descent pretty much are always the same unless the Dungeon Master decides to change them. In Doom, you've actually got a spawn mechanic that the invader can influence. So what basically happens is you have these spawn tokens in certain places, and when the Marines make line of sight with those spawn tokens, you flip them over, and they've each got a set colour. So yellow, blue, or red, I think, are the 3 colours. And at the start of the game, the invader has a particular card that gives him an option on each of these different coloured tokens. So, for example, if you flip a yellow token, you might have a choice between 2 Pinky Demons and 2 Imps, or 1 Baron of Hell and 1 Keiko Demon plus an Argent Power, for example. So the invader gets to make a decision about, you know, do I want more smaller invader demons that can kind of hit and run, for example, or I can send the Pinkies in to do some direct damage and I can use the Imps to hit and run, or do I actually just want to go for the big boys and send in the Baron of Hell and the Keiko Demon? So it's absolutely, there is only a finite number of situations that can occur, but it's still a lot more interesting than, just having an absolute set enemy pattern. And it is more interesting to play as the invader as a result of that. And beyond that, you can just kind of, the game has rules for kind of horde mode where you just have, the potential for score attack type games. It's also a game that, I don't have time really for because I just don't play enough board games for a long enough amount of time to really learn how to dungeon master them properly. But this is the kind of, again, like Descent, this game gives you a toolkit to do that like no other, really. You could create potentially infinite Doom levels by using the modular board and by using the spawn mechanic. And the game includes full rules for doing so, should you be inclined. So again, kind of infinite value for money, even beyond the 12 scenarios, which is, 12 scenarios is not stingy. I think Conan, for example, which I just compared it to, only came with 6 or 8 out of the box. So, it's sort of 50 to 33% more value for money, if you will. And it is amazing. To answer that sort of initial point, it's a really, really good board game. It's probably straight into my probably the best board game I played this year. And bear in mind it's a year-old game. I should really played it last year, but it's straight into my top few games of this year for sure. And I absolutely recommend it. It's fantastic. I would say kids won't like it because some of the artwork is, it's Doom, and the cards are pretty brutal.
Now, both my boys have played the new Doom. They're not fussed by any of that kind of visuals. Right. So you said obviously if the Marines die, they just respawn. Is that like games are now? So there's infinite respawn. So there's no sort of win state for the invaders.
Yeah. So the win state for the invader is actually Marines. So with 1 Marine, I mentioned earlier that the lower the number of Marines, the more perks they get. Yeah. And if you're at 1 Marine, the Marine will have 15 health instead of 10. And if I remember correctly, you also get a card that allows you to increase your action card hand from the default of 3 to 4. And the number of action cards you can hold relates to what I was saying earlier. Chaining cards together and, going through a big killing spree by basically dropping your entire hand if you're able to do so. So a single Marine is quite hard to kill and quite powerful because as long as they can keep getting glory kills, their health will keep going up. And most levels have got health packs on them anyway. So at 1 Marine, the invader automatically wins if they get 4 frags. So they kill that Marine 4 times, they get 4. They win. I think if I remember correctly, at 4 Marines, it's 6 frags that is required by the invader. because you can kill a Marine in one turn with a big demon attack, potentially with only 10 health. And actually, this one thing to probably just cover really quickly, because I didn't mention it before, is that the armor system is really interesting as well. So if you roll, you roll your massive attack, and let's say I roll 5 hits, the way that those hits become wounds, the way that's resolved is by the Marine or the Invader drawing cards from the top of their action deck, which is the same deck that they use to make attacks. And you look at some symbols in the top right-hand corner, and if there's shields there, each of those shields removes one of the damage that was rolled. If there's a little symbol, it's kind of a crazy little symbol, it looks a bit like an hourglass, that's a dodge, which automatically dodges all of the attacks. And then there are some of the special scenarios cards. And I think, I said earlier, this is kind of it's a derivative of Descent, which is quite an old game. And what Fantasy Flight do is they really do a good job of kind of making this toolkit work in different scenarios. And although I think if they'd have built this game from the ground up, from absolutely fresh, they could have probably taken away 1 or 2 different decks of cards and made it just a tiny bit slicker. What they have still done is, by using that one deck of action cards to do multiple things, it deals with attacks and it deals with resolving damage or defending as well. They have taken away at least one mechanic, and they've introduced an interesting element of randomness. It's not a dice roll, it's something different. It incentivizes you to build your deck in a different way. And you do have some optionality about that in relation to which weapon sets you put in your deck and which are more defensive weapons versus offensive weapons. For example, the chainsaw is heavily focused on offense, and some of the tactical rifles are, they're still pretty offensive, but they're a bit better at defense as well. So, it's I just quite liked the way that they managed to create a game that did feel so authentic, despite using this kind of system, if you will. It's in video gaming terms, it's a bit like saying. It's a bit like someone starting with an Unreal Engine, for example, and deciding whether or not it's fit for purpose, and actually saying, yeah, we can work with this, and then building it to the point where it's actually, completely unrecognizable versus the original Unreal that engine was built for. If you follow the logic there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Does the new one have any relation to the older one that came out? I think around the time Doom 3 came out, there was a board game as well.
Yeah, that's true. It's a totally different game, but it's made. In fact, I was just about to say it's made by Fantasy Flight, but I'm not actually sure if that's true or not. I think it might have been a Fantasy Flight game, but Fantasy Flight back in 2003, 2004, very different to how they are now. So since they're kind of, I'd say Fantasy Flight now are actually the premier miniatures-based game manufacturer out there. There's no one else making games in this style, in this frequency, with this level of reliability, aside from probably Games Workshop. And yet, because of the price point and the quality of Fantasy Flight games, it's arguable that they have put the sword to Warhammer, for example, because that's not the way people want to play, and nobody wants to spend £28,000 on an army. I think I traded my Warhammer in for a car, I think, or something like that. So yeah, it's it's the original, or the 2000, I think it's 2003, 2004 Doom is very different. But this isn't called second edition or anything like that. It is a distinctly different game, marketed differently, with exactly the same name. So there is a point there, which is, if you are going to rush out and buy this for anybody, don't pick up the wrong one, even if it is 20 quid, because it's the wrong one for a reason. Spend the 50 or 55, 60 quid, whatever it is, for the 2016 version, because it really is a very good game. And I recommend it as a game that a video gamer could walk straight into without ever playing another board game, understand it and like it. Once you get the hang of it, there's a tutorial mission right in the box. There's 3 manuals. The first manual is just a tutorial mission and a quick start guide, and it just says, ignore the rest of the rules, play this mission, do what we tell you to do, and you'll know how to play the game. And by the end of that tutorial mission, we'd set it up in 15 minutes, and by the end of the mission, we were taking probably less than 20 seconds a turn. And those turns might include the butchering of several demons, the glory killing of several, the drawing of all the cards, the create setup of the initiative phase, etc., etc. It really does fly once you get used to it, and it doesn't take long to get used to.
One thing I noticed is I was looking at your article. It looks like those figurines are really awesomely detailed. What kind of material are they made of? Like, could you paint them? Because they look really, really neat.
Sure. Actually, that is a really good point, and something that is worth talking about against other Fantasy Flight games, because Fantasy Flight make good miniatures up to a good standard, and yet they're not as good as the Games Workshop miniatures of old. And I think that's part of why the price point is a bit lower, even though the standard is good enough. That's not the case with Doom. With Doom, the standard of the miniatures is absolutely exceptional, and I think that's probably the light. When you look at the box for this game, you've got id Software on there, you've got Bethesda as well. I suspect they have forced the miniatures to be produced at a certain quality, and the detail is spectacular. I mean, the Cyber Demon is probably 4 or 5 inches high. It probably weighs a good couple of 100 grams, comes in 3 parts that just push together, and it's a really big, terrifying prospect to face in the game. And similar really for things like Keiko Demons. They're just fantastic sculpts. Even the imps, everything's so dynamic. Everything looks like it's in battle. I think the only downside is probably the Marines, which, again, I've kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt. They kind of look a bit generic, and I do think that's intentional because it kind of fits with the theme of Marines not being important, Marines being fraggable and respawnable. But even so, 2 of them have very similar looking guns and postures, and there's no visual distinction between them in terms of a coloured base or anything. So, if you've got 4 people playing, it would be potentially easy for them to miss which of their Marines was correct. Although that didn't happen to me, I could see how it could happen.
Awesome. It'd be interesting to know whether ID/Bethesda gave them access to the original 3D models to create the miniatures from. Do you think that could possibly be the case?
Well, it is possible. I think I'm getting into the realms of speculation a little bit, but the quality of the plastic is different to most of the Fantasy Flight games. What is usually a problem in Fantasy Flight is that weapons are very droopy. They sort of bend, and you have to warm them up with warm water and kind of bend them back into shape. Now in Doom, the plastic's a little bit harder. It's a different colour for the Marines and the Demons, and it kind of. There is a possibility they were created a different way. The Keiko Demons look like they're made from several parts that have been glued together in manufacturing. So you don't glue them together yourselves, but they do look like they might have been. Similarly, they all come based as well, so there's no need to base them. So it does look as though there's a different manufacturing process in place for Doom than there is for other Fantasy Flight games. But I am just kind of speculating. And yet, there's a bit of evidence for you. It's a conspiracy theory that's to the benefit of the consumer on this occasion.
No, it does sound like a fun little game. I mean, I've not really played any decent board games in years since the friends I used to play with moved away. But if I was ever to get back into it, it would be something like this that I'd get into, because just video games. It's Doom.
It is, and it really is Doom as well. That's the great thing about it. You can play with 2 players or 5, and it works with all of those numbers. Or you can play with 2 players controlling all, and the Marine player could take all of the Marines, for example, and just control them as a squad. There's loads of different ways you can play it, and they're all good fun.
Yeah, I remember me and my friends doing 2-player hero quest like that. One was the master, and one played all 4 of the other characters. It always worked out quite well.
Yeah, I used to do the same. Yeah. That's probably how I'd play it today if I was playing it, to be honest, because Hero Quest looks great, and the kids don't want to play that nowadays. Usually, it's kind of very, very basic, isn't it? I've got a lot of good memories of it. That's for sure. If I hadn't played Hero Quest and Space Crusade, I wouldn't be playing Doom today.
I mean, I was very impressed with the pictures that I saw of the game. I really like the quality of the pieces. Do you think this kind of system would work with other games? I mean, Doom's pretty much, well, it was a corridor shooter, wasn't it, very much? So, I mean, it suits this down to the ground, but I can't think of much else that would tie in well to that. Possibly a Warhammer game, but we don't talk about that in relation to anyone other than Games Workshop, do we?
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is, it has worked for, Star Wars Imperial Assault, for example. That's a very popular game, which is actually a bit more complex than the Doom interpretation of the Descent mold, if you will. And the other game I've played like that is Mansions of Madness, which, without kind of getting into a whole other topic about other games, Mansions of Madness actually has some really, really powerful mechanics in it, to the point where the game I played lasted about 3 hours, and it ended with the entire mansion catching fire around about the middle, and half the survivors being trapped on one side, or investigators rather, they are in Mansions of Madness, half were trapped on one side and half were trapped on the other. And the cultists, the Cthulhu demons, and the investigators were all burned and or unable to escape from the house. And so with that kind of this is the same template basically, just with different things being allowed to happen within the rule set provided. In that game, as the dungeon master, I simply had to create different scenarios on the fly to enable anyone to win, because we were all going to die. So, it's a very powerful tool set. People are doing lots of really smart things with it, certainly much, much further beyond than what I would be able to do with it. But I think it's transferable potentially to other video games with relatively small tweaks. And I think what you'd end up with more often than not is something in between Imperial Assault and Doom, because the glory kill and the speed mechanics used for Doom probably aren't that relevant to many computer games. But some of the kind of more, the Imperial Assault angle is everyone's a hit, or many people are heroes. So, for example, Han Solo and Luke Skywalker have very different skills. And there are some generic troops as well on both sides. So that's where the focus is in Imperial Assault. Whereas clearly in Doom, the Marines are all generic, and I guess if anything, the combat nuance in Doom comes from which weapons you've got selected, because that drives your action cards and that drives your behaviour. So yeah, it's a very powerful model, and I'd love to see it used for the computer games. I wouldn't like to suggest one, but many that would work really well. Things like, for example, Stalker. You could take that horror theme, you could take some of the Mansions of Madness features, and you could make the survivor, again, for lack of a better term, much more vulnerable in that kind of model. And you could bring in some of the investigative and searching mechanics from Mansions, and you create a whole other kind of rule set. But I think again, the Fantasy Flight angle would be that they would only look at games that they know would make them money. That's the key thing. They are a profitable organisation that looks first and foremost to stay profitable. It's not, a bloke in his basement making things because he loves them. It's an organisation there to do the best they can. So, Fallout might be a better example of something that they would pick up, particularly because, they've got Doom, so they've got a Bethesda relationship. And yet at the same time, Doom never attracted an expansion pack. Although it was critically considered to be quite good last year, it isn't in any top 10 lists. No one cares deeply about it apart from possibly me. And no one's rushing out to buy it. So I do wonder if perhaps, it's had the rough end of the kind of board game trend, really, which is probably more for, Euro games. And I guess, although it's a cooperative shooter, it's also extremely direct. And maybe that Fantasy Flight mold does put some more hardcore games off, because clearly Conan was a commercial success. And even though the two games feel a little bit similar to play, Conan continues to sell like hotcakes, and was, you couldn't get it for a long time. And a lot of people are saying it was one of the best games of 2016. Doom is kind of as good as far as I'm concerned. I actually like the theme of Conan a bit more. I like the bigger boards. I like the bigger range of miniatures. And yet, if someone came around to my house and said, I want to play a game that's a bit like a video game and I've got an hour, I would never wheel out Conan, because you can be chopping up baddies for 2 hours in Conan, and it can be more complicated to explain. I think Doom, you can get a game going in 15 minutes, as I said earlier, and you can finish in easily under an hour.